Hello, everyone. Good morning and a very warm welcome to NParks' third Wildlife Human Encounters webinar. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. My name is Rebecca and I'll be your host for this morning. Our efforts to enhance our natural spaces have brought people closer to nature and wildlife. This is the third session of a series of webinars where we'll be covering the different wildlife species commonly encountered and the science-based approach in understanding their ecology and distribution as we promote a responsible and positive human-wildlife coexistence. Today's webinar is on the theme of wild boars in our city in nature. We will be joined by our colleagues, Mr. Bryan Lim and Mr. Thaddaeus Cheng from NParks Wildlife Management team. Both Bryan and Thaddaeus are actively involved in integrative management approaches to mitigate human-boar interactions in Singapore. This morning, they will share more about wild boars, their ethology and distribution, and practical tips on what to do when we encounter wild boars in our city in nature. After their dialogue, we will be having a short Q&A session, starting with some questions that you all have pre-submitted. If you have any additional questions along the way, do send them to Serena as a private message using the Zoom chat, and we will try to share some of these during the Q&A. I hope you're as excited to hear from our speakers as I am. I promise it'll be anything but boring. Bryan and Thaddaeus, over to you, please.
Thanks, Becky, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. As mentioned, Bryan and I will be sharing on wild boars, their management, and how we can coexist with them in our city and nature. So just to give everyone a brief overview of what will be covered today, I'll first introduce some characteristics of wild boars, such as their distribution, their habitat, before moving on to some key aspects of their ecology, which looks at how humans, animals like wild boars, and the physical environment interact with each other. After which, I'll hand over the session to the main star of the show, Bryan, who will share about some tools we use to manage our wild boar populations in a dense urban area like Singapore. He'll then move on to share about how to responsibly behave around wild boars, should you encounter them, and some key aspects of the Wildlife Act and our community engagement efforts. So the wild boar is also known as the Eurasian wild pig, and its scientific name is Sus scrofa, which translates from the Latin words for swine and sow. And a little bit about wild boar terminology, though. The term boar is actually used to denote the adult male of some species, including domestic pigs. However, for wild boar, it applies to the whole species. So for example, we call their young wild boar piglets. Wild boars are native to Singapore, being naturally found in Asia, Europe, and some parts of Africa. And they are really one of the widest ranging mammals in the world. The main predator is the grey wolf in most of the wild boars range, with the exception of the tiger and the Komodo dragon in the Far East and the Lesser Sunda Islands. Now, they are highly adaptable, being found in a variety of habitats from forest to scrubland, and then it's actually become an invasive species in parts of its introduced range, as seen in the blue highlights on the map on the right. Now, some contributing factors for their wide range include their deliberate introduction in areas such as America, where they were brought over as game animals by wealthy landowners, and they were brought over as livestock in others. So as such, the wild boar has had a long association with humans being the ancestor of most domestic pig breeds you see these days. Escaped domestic pigs can turn feral, and they pose issues being an invasive species themselves. However, but due to the fact that they can hybridize and interbreed with native wild boars, they can actually result in boar-pig hybrids, which are even larger, maxing out at around 200 kilograms for males. So it's a good thing that in Singapore, we don't really have any pig farms. Now, a little bit on the characteristics of wild boars. Wild boars can live for over 10 years in the wild, and the adult sizes of wild boars can range quite drastically throughout its range. Like many species, wild boars follow an ecogeographical rule, where smaller individuals are found near the tropics and larger ones towards the poles. So locally, our adult males are known to grow up to around 120 kilograms. Adult males are usually solitary outside the breeding season, so the next time you see a lone wild boar, there's a good chance he's a member of the Lonely Hearts Club looking for love. They develop tusks, continuously growing teeth that protrude out of their mouth, and these serve as weapons and tools to defend themselves against predators. It is for this reason that tigers generally avoid tackling mature male boars. Now, females, on the other hand, are smaller and they live in groups called sounders. And these groups comprise of them, their offspring, as well as sub-adult males. Now, the group structure of wild boars changes with three key movements. One would be the coming and going of females giving birth in a process known as farrowing. And two would be the migration of maturing males, usually when they reach around 20 months of age. And three would be the arrival of unrelated sexually active males. Females also have sharp canines, but in contrast to the males, they're much smaller and they don't protrude out as much. Females can be defensive, especially when they have piglets, so it's best to give them a wide berth if you do encounter them. Now, wild boar piglets are colored differently from the adults, having marbled chocolate and cream stripes lengthwise over their body and look almost watermelon-like, as you can see at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. These stripes are thought to help with camouflage, and they fade by the time the piglet is around 6 months of age. Now, females become sexually mature around 8 to 24 months of age, and this depends on how favorable the environmental conditions are, which include factors like how nutritious their food is. The pregnancy of a female wild boar lasts approximately 4 months, and during this time, a few days before giving birth, the sow will actually leave the group to construct a mound-like nest that comprises of vegetation and dirt, and it is this process that's known as farrowing. Now, after giving birth to a litter of about 4 to 8 piglets, the mother and her young remain in or nearby this nest for around a week or so, after which they will rejoin the group. And raising young is really quite a team effort for wild boars, as the piglets actually cross-suckle between all available lactating females. Now, the adaptability of wild boars to a variety of habitats is behind its success as a species and its potential to be an invasive one in many areas of the world. Now, species like wild boars often have a common set of characteristics. They are generalists in their diets, meaning that they can forage and they can utilize a wide range of food sources, and they have a high reproductive and survival rates that are often correlated to reduced competition and predation. Lastly, they're often easily habituated to human activities as well. As such, in Singapore, we can find them across our forests, to our beaches, and back in our grasslands. So it's no surprise that another characteristic that promotes the success of wild boars as a species is their ability to disperse into new areas. And this sometimes involves swimming. But such cases are quite unusual, as they are usually more than happy to stay where they are if they have enough space and food to keep them busy. Now, a little on wild boar ecology. They're considered ecosystem engineers through the way that they change the physical environment, which in turn affects how other organisms use resources in the environment. So, for example, they affect the soil nutrient cycle together with via their foraging behavior, and this can influence what species of plants grow in an area. So wild boars play a variety of roles in ecological processes, and the mechanisms such as seed dispersal and seed predation give rise to the changes I described earlier. Now, seed dispersal happens when a wild boar eats a fruit and swallows the seed whole, and during its wandering journey of its habitat, happily poops them along, spreading the seeds which then germinate into adult plants. Now, seed predation, on the other hand, occurs when a wild boar eats a fruit and in the process crushes and destroys the seed, rendering it unviable. And such processes influence the different compositions of plant communities in a wild boar's habitat. Now, the wild boar, apart from being a competitor for resources with other ungulates, it also has a very key role in food webs, being both the predator of smaller animals such as ground nesting birds, as well as prey for larger animals such as large pythons. Now, a little bit about wild boar behavior. Wild boar are generally nocturnal, but they can be crepuscular in certain situations, such as a local context. This means that they're more active during dawn and dusk, and this is why most wild boar sightings are after the sun sets, as wild boars prefer to rest during the heat of the day. Now, the behavior of wild boar activity peaking around dusk is shown at the top right, which is actually a graph of camera trap trigger frequency. Camera traps are one of the research tools we use to study wild boars amongst many other animals. And what they are is actually motion-triggered cameras, which are placed at various locations throughout the forest. And based on what the animals that are captured in these camera traps, the timings and the frequency of these captures, we can then carry out analyses to look at things such as species richness of an area, the relative abundance of one species to another, as well as to infer the behaviors of species and how this relates to behaviors of other animals. And now on to wild boar management. I'll hand this session over to Bryan. Thank you.
Thank you, Thaddeus. Yep, so NParks, we adopt a holistic science-based approach to our wildlife management, where usually studies are carried out to understand the population ecology of our wildlife better, including our native wild boars. So far, we have commenced a number of research projects on our native wild boars. This study, of course, includes a yearly population density study to monitor and track population growth, a study to identify population distributions across our nature areas, and to identify hotspots, if there are any, and also to implement targeted appropriate management and mitigation measures for these hotspots. So the reasons for the wild boars have been cited in our forest for for a number of reasons. Firstly is the lack of large natural predators. So historically, there is a population of Malayan tigers in our forests that preys on these larger mammals such as wild boars. However, with the date of our last tiger in the 1930s, the wild boar population will increase over time. In addition to the lack of natural predators, the nutrient-rich food source of old kampongs has also provided a reliable year-long food source for our wildlife. Of course, this is also coupled by illegal supplementary feeding, which may of course ultimately lead to an unregulated increase in numbers. Of course, there will be potential impacts of wild boars on our forests and of course the urban city. The foraging habits of wild boars can of course impact habitat regeneration in our forests by their digging behavior, which uproots young plants and saplings. For urban areas adjacent to forested ones, potential traffic accidents and human-wildlife incidences can result when the population grows too large. So one of the habitat modification measures to manage our wild boar population is landscape change. The removal of food source, especially non-native plants, can help manage the population. Some commonly planted food sources are edible roots and tubers such as yam and tapioca, as well as oil palms. These food plants are present in forested old kampongs. Oil palm is actually a native plant to Africa, and its seeds have been spread across the region, commonly seen in massive plantations in Malaysia and Indonesia these days. They are used in a variety of products in the pharmaceutical, energy, and even the cosmetic industries. So oil palms in Singapore, they have been around for quite some time already, with the records in the Singapore Botanic Gardens showing the first seeds were received in the early 19th century. Since then, the oil palm has proliferated in many forested areas of Singapore. With the rich nutrients and high fat content of these oil palm kernels, this plant has become a favorite food for our local wild boars, and they have been linked to an increased occurrence and an unregulated increase in the reproductive rate of wild boars. In addition, this high nutritious diet could possibly result in the wild boar spending less energy and time foraging and thus having more time to reproduce. So recent studies in oil palm plantations around the forested areas of Malaysia by Luskin and his team have shown that the number of wild boars are actually correlated to oil palm production. Another study conducted by the same research team also found that fencing is able to exclude wild boars in the understory of forests and show that wild boars have indeed an impact on the regeneration of our understory forests. So wild boars, they also, like what I mentioned earlier, wild boars, they have engaged in a behavior also known as rooting, where they use their snout, their strong noses to push or nudge something repeatedly. And this is done for a variety of reasons, which includes communication and, of course, to look for food. So wild boars, they are excellent diggers. These behaviors can often be quite disruptive over large expanses of land as they forage for invertebrates and tubers beneath the ground. Precisely because of their tendency and ability to dig, it is important that barriers intended to exclude them should be buried underneath the ground around 30 centimeters to be safe. Ideally, of course, galvanized steel barriers should also be used, but any sturdy hoarding should suffice. Of course, innovation is always welcome, and some sturdy yet soft fence types, such as those used in from our friends in the Singapore Island Country Club, have shown to be effective. So precisely because of this, their tendency to dig, the normal green chain link fence that you see in the image below is not strong enough. They can easily dig under the fence. So to improve on this design, and of course to enhance this design, you can of course add a cement base to this green chain link fence, such as this fence located at Pasir Ris Heights. So ideally, of course, like what I mentioned earlier, a galvanized steel fence, also known as some examples are BRC fencing, like the one in Pasir Ris Park, can prevent wild boars from digging under. And the soft yet sturdy fencing that I mentioned earlier by our friends at Singapore Island Country Club, they employed this unique fence which is made out of soft wires where there are no injuries to animals, and they have shared their results that their wild boar visits have dropped by almost 90%. So of course, in order to prevent roadkills, a roadway animal detection system, or RADS in short, was designed together with our colleagues at LTA to alert oncoming vehicles with flashing lights when there are animals crossing. So this system actually employ the use of real-time CCTV to monitor wildlife crossing. So whenever there's a wildlife crossing the road, an earlier CCTV downstream will record it, and the upstream warning flashing lights will show to alert the cars or motorists to slow down. So next, moving on. So what are some responsible interactions the public should have with wild boars? Number one, and one of the most important points to take note, is to stay calm and walk away slowly when you encounter one. Wild boars, like most other wildlife in general, are of course shy by nature. So avoid approaching or provoking the wild boar, as it may feel threatened and thereafter become defensive. Of course, sometimes wild boar, when they are foraging, they are often unaware of their surroundings, and any sudden movements may actually alarm them. As you know, nowadays, most people, when they see a wild animal or see something out of the ordinary, their first instinct is to take out their mobile phone and go closer to take a photo and video. That's actually a wrong thing to do, because you may ultimately get too close to the wild animal, and the wild animal may act defensive and try to and maybe come closer to you. Okay, secondly, do keep your dog on the leash and keep a safe distance from female wild boars with their young. So female wild boars with their young, they are very wary of their surroundings in order to, of course, protect their piglets. They can easily become aggressive when they are defending their young from both humans and dogs. Wild animals, as you all know, often demonstrate a fight or flight behavior, and with a smaller dog in sight, usually they may choose to fight the dogs instead. So dogs, on the other hand, they are often unaware of the dangers posed by wild boars and other wild animals, and may attempt to even bark at it, or some may even think that it's a friendly animal and decides to play with it. So adding on to the earlier segment on taking your mobile phone to take photo, please do not use flash photography on wild boars. So usually wild boars, they are nocturnal animals, and their eyes are very sensitive to sudden bursts of light. So these can actually upset the wild boar and may cause them to turn aggressive as well. Last, but certainly not the least, please do not feed wild boars. So feeding of wild boars, actually, they have many negative impacts on both human and the species. Feeding of wild boars, of course, NParks, of course, we take a very strong stance and very tough stance on the feeding of wildlife. So feeding of wild boars can actually result in a fine of up to $10,000. Also note that feeding of wild boars in our nature reserves could also incur a more severe fine under our Parks and Trees Act. One of the main reasons why wildlife such as wild boars approach human is actually due to feeding. Feeding, unintentional or otherwise, alters the natural behavior of our wildlife. So firstly, for wild boars, they actually change their nocturnal behavior to a diurnal one. Diurnal means they come out more in the day. This also habituates them to human presence and the reliance on humans for easy source of food. Wild boars also may have an increased propensity to approach humans when they associate humans as food providers, and this may lead to them displaying aggressive behavior towards people, venturing into urban areas in search for human sources of food, and of course, wandering onto roads and posing a danger to both motorists and of course the wild boars themselves. By observing a case of a popular public feeding spot along Halus, the feeding of wild boars actually resulted in an unnatural behavior of wild boars foraging together. As shared earlier by my colleague Thaddaeus, male wild boars are usually solitary animals, while female and the young move together in a herd. So in this image above, you can see both male, female, and their young all foraging together, exhibiting this extremely unnatural behavior that was brought about by food provisioning. In addition, feeding wildlife with processed food can also cause them to have health problems as the food is not suitable for them. In the long run, wildlife may also lose their natural foraging skills and struggle to survive in the natural environment when there's no readily available food source. So furthermore, animals such as wild boars also fulfill ecological roles such as seed dispersers, and these processes will be disrupted when they rely on humans for food instead. So on the 1st of June in 2020, last year, the Amended Wildlife Act commenced, and there were new provisions restricting feeding of wild boars and other wildlife under the Section 5A. So Section 5A of our Wildlife Act, states that a person must not intentionally feed wildlife in any place. A person who contravenes this shall be guilty of an offence and shall be liable on conviction for a first offence to a fine of not exceeding $5,000, and for a second or subsequent offence to a fine not exceeding $10,000. So our Wildlife Act was actually designed to better protect, preserve, and manage Singapore wildlife. So some of you who do not know what are wildlife exactly. So wildlife is actually defined as any species of animals of wild nature. So which includes here wild boars, long-tailed macaques, squirrels, and of course wild birds. As shown in the infographic above. So wildlife, of course, excludes domestic dogs, including stray dogs, horse, cattle, sheep, goats, domestic pigs, and even poultry. To share more on the Wildlife Act, so in addition to the consequences of wildlife feeding, the releasing of wildlife too will incur a maximum fine of also up to $5,000. So releasing of wildlife actually impacts the natural ecosystem negatively more often than not. These captive bred animals that are released die soon after. Lastly, of course, the killing, trapping, taking, or keeping of wildlife can also incur a fine of $20,000 and or 12 months jail. So NParks, we actually take a very strong and stern stand on wildlife feeding. Earlier this year, we actually brought offenders to court and charged them for wildlife feeding. So usually the population and distribution of wildlife is actually very well regulated through the resources available in the natural environment. What feeding does, feeding actually causes an artificial increase in food, which may result in an unnatural and unsustainable increase in populations. So this action contributes to, of course, increased human-wildlife conflict and also upsets the ecological balance. So back in 2020, if you all remember, there were two viral videos floating around social media showing wild boars snatching food from visitors to Cheng. This is, of course, indeed a very unnatural behavior for these species, which are extremely shy by nature. So this actually strongly suggests that these wild boars were very habituated to human food by the persistent feeding. And of course, this resulted in them getting bolder and snatching food deliberately, posing a danger to unaware visitors. So another contributing factor is, of course, due to the high volume of human-wildlife interactions at this Pulau Ubin, one of our recreational sites. So through our daily monitoring efforts on the sites itself, so NParks, what we managed to do, we managed to identify actually the 3 wild boars responsible for this bold behavior. So some management measures executed here at Pulau Ubin included advisory signage and of course NParks staff to deploy at peak periods. So this is to remind our park goers to keep all food source inside your bags, don't expose any food source, and especially plastic bags, since plastic bags are often associated to food to animals. So in the past, when monkeys see a plastic bag, usually the habituated monkeys or long-tailed macaques see a plastic bag, they know it's food, but now this behavior has been extended to wild boars as well. So throughout our monitoring efforts, we also saw that the wild boars were targeting the bicycles, especially the baskets in front of the bicycles, and hence the bicycle parking area at Chek Jawa was fenced up and to deter them from access. So moving on to what should you do when you come across injured wild boars. First of all, number 1 is do not attempt to handle the wild boar or get close to it. So these animals, especially wild boars, huge mammals like wild boars, they are and can be very dangerous even if they are injured. So because the animal is wild in nature, and when it's injured or immobilized, okay, there will be a lot of adrenaline running through its body, and they may even bite you as an act of self-defense. So of course, please do not pick up injured piglets as well. Okay, what should you do? You should keep a safe distance of about 20 meters from where the injured wild boar is. And of course, do not hesitate to call our 24 hours Animal Response Center at 1-800-476-1600 for immediate assistance. So our wildlife management division, we also conduct engagement sessions for a wide variety of stakeholders, from individuals to the industry and other agencies as well, from the educational standees in public areas to sharing with schools of different levels, all with the goal to inform the public of responsible wildlife behavior in our city in nature. We also tailor solutions to recalcitrant offenders, to persistent wildlife feeding, to identify the motivations behind their problem behavior and offer alternatives to change their behavior, of course with the help for our AIC colleagues, the Agency for Integrated Care. Of course, to help animal managing industries to improve their operational work, NParks, what we did, we organized a multi-modular animal training sessions to these animal management companies for safe and ethical animal handling. So ultimately, what this does is actually allows the handler to feel safe when handling animal, and of course to minimize stress to the animal itself. So together with other agencies, we also do conduct joint outreach efforts for our residents that are living in our city in nature. So of course, together with our institutional partners, we also work with the media on stories to highlight why people shouldn't feed wildlife. So NParks, what we also have, provide a wide variety of advisory signage and engaging posters for outreach purposes. All these actually play a role to spread awareness of the negative impacts on the wildlife feeding, and of course highlight some points of the new Wildlife Act to the public. I apologize for the wrong formatting in the text box on the top left-hand corner, but NParks, we have a 24-hour animal response center for the public to call if they require any wildlife-related assistance. So lastly, we also have a Youth Stewards for Nature program, which is a 6-month-long program suitable for youth aged 18 to 25 years old with some experience in relevant fields such as horticulture, environmental studies, biological or life sciences, or have completed any other relevant nature programs. So these youths, what they can take up projects in small groups to assist the implementation of a real-world project, and each team or small groups will be mentored by NParks staff, and of course gain access to a panel of resource. So this year we have 3 youths, Carl, Tina, and Yu Peng, who have been nominated to work on a nationwide campaign to educate public on responsible wildlife behaviors and the negative impact of wildlife feeding. So together with our NParks staff, these youth will set out to understand the general perceptions of the public towards feeding, and of course develop targeted education and outreach initiative to mitigate the feeding of wildlife, and of course nudge responsible wildlife interaction behavior. With that, we've come to the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Bryan and Thaddaeus, for that in-depth talk, teaching us more about wild boar behavior, as well as discussing how we can work towards human-wildlife coexistence in our city and nature, as well as reminding us of some best practices that we can take when we do see them in our green spaces. Now moving on to our Q&A session. So thank you to everyone in the audience who submitted their questions. We have had quite an overwhelming response of questions, so I do apologize in advance if we are not able to cover every question, but we'll try to answer as many as possible. So going on to our first question, where are wild boars spotted within mainland Singapore? And are there wild boars on Sentosa and other offshore islands too? So for this first question, I'll invite Thad to answer.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, as mentioned earlier, wild boars are highly adaptable. They can be found in a variety of habitats worldwide. Locally, we can find them in our forests, our mangroves, and our grasslands. And this is true for many wilder parts of mainland Singapore, as well as the wilder offshore islands such as Pulau Ubin and Pulau Tekong. But given the highly urbanized nature and the usually pricey entry into Sentosa, we haven't had any recent wild boar records there.
All right, thanks, Thad. So moving on to our next question, what are the chances of being attacked if unaware people walk or run close to a wild boar, foraging next to a trail? And what do we do if that happens? So once again, I'll ask Thad to answer this question.
Thanks, Becky. In almost all cases, it's actually quite likely that the wild boar knows that you're headed its way long before you guys actually cross paths. And if the wild boar is actually still present, it's very likely that he will be unbothered by you walking past, unless your behavior changes and it gives it something to be defensive about. So as such, it's always important to remember what Bryan shared earlier about responsible behavior around wild boars. Always respect all wildlife, keep your distance, and let them pass first if necessary. And also be sure to look out for watermelons, the little wild boars, in case a defensive mommy is watching over them protectively from a distance. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Thad. So for our next question, someone who is obviously a farmer has asked this question, but I think it does apply to anyone who is whose property is close to wild boars. So the question is, wild boars enter my farm and destroy my crops regularly. I have fenced up my farm, but they get in by damaging the fence too. What should I do? So Bryan, over to you for this one.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the question, and thanks to our farmer for the question as well. So it actually suggests that it's very likely that your current fence does not have sufficient structural integrity to prevent wild boars from entering. So shared earlier, wild boars have a very strong snout, okay, and very excellent digging and a very good digging ability. So a fence of actually a stronger material is needed. The ideal fence, just to share again, the ideal fence is of course one made of galvanized steel, and then of course anchored by a cement base. And these measures will permanently prevent wild boars from entering the premise, and of course ultimately protecting your
Got it. Thanks, Bryan. So for the next question, someone's asked, what is the wild boar population number in Singapore? Bryan, back to you for this one.
Yeah, so within Singapore's nature reserve, our research in 2019 and 2020 have showed that we have between 150 to 200 wild boars now living in our nature reserves. And this number is actually within the carrying capacity for our forests. So today, we are still carrying out population studies for these wild boars to understand their ecology better. As what I shared earlier, we have yearly population counts. This year, we are looking into a more holistic ecological project, which includes, of course, home ranges and wild boar movement research.
Thanks, Bryan. So for the next question, I think this is a very hot topic of this period. Do wild boars in Singapore carry any diseases that may be transmitted to humans via casual contact? So Bryan, I think I'll pass this one back to you as well.
NParks, we actually have a biosurveillance team, okay, and we have been conducting biosurveillance on all our wildlife, of course, to detect any possible zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases, just to share, are diseases that can be passed from wild animals, wildlife through humans. So as of today, there are no zoonotic diseases from wild boars in Singapore. Therefore, there will not be any transmission to humans via casual contact. But of course, please do not casually contact a wild boar. Keep your safe distance from it and don't get too close. Yep.
I wonder what the question asker means by casual contact, meeting for coffee or something. Not sure. So for the next question, someone's asked, what are the measures taken to control the wild boar population in Singapore? So Thad, over to you for this question.
So in terms of measures taken to control the wild boar population, research to look at the populations and the distribution of wild boars throughout Singapore's nature areas, as Bryan has just shared. And the point of such studies is to enable us to understand what environmental variables play a role in determining where they occur, and this then helps us identify areas for conservation and also areas where there's a higher potential for human wild boar conflict. And with this information, we can then prioritize our management efforts, which we shared earlier. For example, habitat modification through the removal and the replacement of the invasive but nutrient-rich oil palms with native plant species that also are in line with our conservation goals as well.
Thanks. So moving on and kind of expanding on this question, someone's also asking, can culling be considered as a control measure since wild boars are now foraging near urban areas? So Thad, back to you for this one.
So with regards to culling, I think it's important for us to say that, for NParks, public safety will always be our priority. And in some cases, such as the Pongo incident in February, NParks may decide to humanely euthanize a wild boar where there is a risk to the public. But it's important for the public to know that such cases will decrease if human feeding stops, as there will not be an unnatural growth in population, and there won't be a habituation of wild boars to humans. So that's really key to stop wildlife feeding. Yeah.
All right, thanks for that, Thad. So for the next question, someone's asked, what are the efforts taken to manage human-boar encounters as more forested areas are being developed? So Bryan, maybe I'll pass this one over to you.
Yep, thanks, Rebecca. So for NParks, of course, public safety will always be prioritized above all. For areas where there are developments, NParks, we will work with developing agencies to coordinate construction timelines to ensure the erection of adequate hoarding, which will prevent wild boars from dispersing to adjacent urban areas where available, and we will coordinate efforts to actually guide them to adjacent forest patches.
Right. So yeah, this is kind of a broad question that covers a lot of what we talked about today. How do we adapt and coexist with wild boars? So maybe I'll give both of you the chance to answer, or just one. Maybe we'll start with Bryan.
Yep. So as shared earlier, throughout the whole site, this webinar is actually to ultimately teach everyone, or inform everyone how to interact responsibly with wild boars, and of course coexist with these wild boars. So number one, if I would like to repeat number one, of course, keep a safe distance from the wild boar, and observe the wild boar actually from afar, instead of course going near it and taking a photo of it through your mobile phones. Second point, and of course the most important point that has been repeated over and over again, is actually the no feeding of wild boars. Okay, so wild boars, they are actually the main reasons why wild boars will come out and approach humans for food. Feeding of wildlife so actually alters their natural behavior and habituates them to human presence. Um, for habituated wild boar that has been, let's say, being fed by the same feeder over and over again, when a new member of public come along and suddenly the wild boar walks up to that person, thinking the person will give food, this will of course number one, scare the person who don't know how to react when they see a wild boar, and then when they get too close the wild boar, the person might actually frighten the wild boar, and wild boar may exhibit some defensive behavior. So how do we, so Ted, any more things to add?
In terms of coexistence. No, Bryan, you covered it really well. Thank you very much. I don't think I have anything else to add.
All right, thanks both Bryan and Thad. So yeah, I think one really important thing that's coming out from this is just how we have responsible behavior in terms of our interaction when we see wild boars. So someone's asked, kind of related to that, since the commencement of the Wildlife Act last June, how many offences related to wild boar have been processed? So this could be both feeding, release, anything, trapping, anything like that. Bryan, any thoughts?
Yep. So ever since the commencement of the Wildlife Act, we have been embarking on a huge no feeding campaign to inform people. Of course, also the commencement of Wildlife Act, and of course now that there are how to say, the people are aware now that feeding of wildlife is illegal. So in January earlier this year, actually a total of 19 individuals we have been brought that were brought to court for feeding of wild boars at Lorong Halus, wild boar feeding hotspots. Since then, of course, 11 individuals have pleaded guilty, and they were fined of $2,500 each.
All right, thanks, Bryan. So someone in the audience has asked, my child's asked, are wild boars friends or pests? How should I answer? It's a good question. Bryan, any thoughts?
Let me take this one. Sure. All right, I'll take this one. That's an interesting question. So the terms pests or friends, I reckon are a little bit extreme for the case of wild boars, because pests are animals that cause destruction and are a nuisance, and friends would allude more to community animals like dogs and cats. So I think my answer would be that they are neither. They're native wild animals that should be respected, and ideally without the feeding of wild boars, they're more than likely to remain in the forest where they will be neither a pest or a friend nor a friend. Yeah.
Thanks for that. All right, I think that kind of concludes how all the questions for today, ending off with a really nice one of saying, yeah, then neither, I feel like it's quite a divisive one, but ultimately they are part of our native biodiversity, and as long as we appreciate them from afar, yeah, we can all live in coexistence. So with that, I'd like to thank Bryan and Thaddaeus once again for their sharing, and a big thank you to our audience both on Zoom and on YouTube for joining us today. Our next webinar will be in July this year, and it will be about otters in our city in nature. Do keep a lookout for the sign up link on the NParks events page coming up soon. So thank you to all for attending this session and have a great day ahead. Thank you.